Every clock you've ever checked, every circle you've ever drawn, every alphabet you've ever read. All of it traces back to one people, a people who had no forests, no stone, no iron, no copper in the ground beneath their feet. Just mud, reeds, and 2 rivers that could drown them without warning. By every rule of geography, they should have failed. Instead, they invented civilization itself, writing, law, medicine, the wheel, the school, the very idea of a city. And then the world forgot they existed, completely, for 4,000 years. This isn't ancient history in the way you usually picture it. This is the story of the people who built the operating system. Every civilization after them has been running on. Egypt, Greece, Rome, and everyone since. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how a handful of villages on a floodplain invented cities, writing, and law from nothing, and how they vanished so completely that no one even knew to look for them. Here's the paradox at the center of this story. The civilization that invented writing, so that nothing would ever have to be forgotten again, was itself forgotten, completely. For longer than most of recorded history has even existed. Southern Mesopotamia is not a place that invites settlement. Summers are brutal. Rain is rare, and when it does come, it comes as a wall of water that floods the plain and vanishes, leaving cracked earth behind. The Tigris and the Euphrates don't behave like the Nile. There's no predictable schedule. They surge without warning. They change course. They erase villages in a single season. The people who eventually settled here wrote a flood into their deepest mythology. A single man, Utnapishtim, building a boat to survive the wrath of the gods. Thousands of years later, that same story would resurface in the book of Genesis as Noah. But underneath the danger was opportunity. Centuries of flooding had left behind some of the richest soil on Earth. The catch was brutal and simple: control the water or die. Before this new people arrived, someone else was already here. A culture archaeologists call the Ubaid. They dug the first irrigation ditches. They built the first mud brick shrines. They farmed, they settled, they survived. But they never built a city. They never wrote a word. They never organized themselves into anything resembling a state. Then, near the end of the 4th millennium BC, a new people appeared. We don't know where they came from. Their language has no known relatives anywhere on Earth. Linguists call it an isolate, a tongue standing completely alone. Even the words for their own rivers, and for basic farming, plow, sow, farmer, were borrowed from someone else's language. Someone was here first. They just took everything that already existed and turned it into something the world had never seen. Here's the part almost nobody tells you. The city was not born from ambition. It was born from a spreadsheet problem. To survive here, you couldn't just plant a seed and wait. You had to cut canals across miles of open ground. You had to raise embankments to hold back the spring floods. You had to dredge the silt out, year after year, or the whole system collapsed. This wasn't work for one family. It required thousands of people, coordinated, every single season. Miss 1 year of maintenance, and the canals silt shut. Miss 1 year of repairs, and the embankments fail. The rivers didn't forgive mistakes. Someone had to organize this. Someone had to assign labor, measure the water, and settle disputes between the villages upstream and the villages downstream. And from that necessity, a new kind of power was born. At the center of every city stood a stepped tower rising over the flat plain like a man-made mountain, the ziggurat. It wasn't only a temple, it was the tax office, the granary, the courthouse, and sometimes the factory, all at once. The priests who ran it controlled the land, the water, the surplus grain, and the labor. In their eyes, everything belonged to the gods. The priests simply managed it on the gods' behalf. By around 3800 BC, the village was no longer how people lived here. The city had arrived. And the greatest of these cities was Uruk, home, at its peak, to somewhere between 40 and 80,000 people. For creatures who had lived in bands of 20 or 30 for hundreds of thousands of years, this was an entirely new kind of existence. In a village, you know every face, every debt is remembered. In a city of 50,000 strangers, that system falls apart completely. Order can no longer live in people's memory. It has to live somewhere else. Here's what surprises most people. The earliest writing on Earth isn't poetry. It isn't prayer. It isn't myth. It's an inventory. The oldest clay tablets ever found, dated to roughly 3,300 BC, are tax records. Wage ledgers, lists of sheep, barley, and units of labor. Writing wasn't born from inspiration. It was born from bureaucracy. Before the tablets, temple officials tracked debts with small clay tokens. A cone for 1 unit of grain, a ball for 10. Thousands of these tokens have been dug out of the ground across the region. But as the economy of Uruk grew, keeping physical tokens for everything became impossible. So officials made a decision that would change human history. Instead of storing the token, they pressed its shape into wet clay. The object became an image. From there, it accelerated fast. The pressed marks turned into simplified drawings. A head meant head. A bowl meant food. A foot meant to walk. At first, the system was enormous and clumsy, over 2,000 separate signs. But eventually, someone realized a symbol could represent not just a thing, but a sound. Once that happened, everything changed. Full sentences, grammar, nuance, abstract thought, pressed permanently into clay. They used a reed stylus, angled into soft clay, leaving wedge-shaped marks, cuneiform. It became the dominant script of the entire ancient Near East for over 3,000 years, still in use as late as the 1st century AD. That's twice as long as the span between the fall of Rome and today. And clay turned out to be the perfect medium. Papyrus rots. Parchment burns. Clay, once fired, even by accident, in the fires that destroyed the cities storing it, becomes almost indestructible. Over 1 million tablets have been recovered so far. Archaeologists are still finding more. For the first time in human history, a debt, a tax, an obligation couldn't be forgotten, denied, or quietly rewritten. A system now remembered more than any single person ever could. Once you start listing what this civilization actually invented, it gets almost absurd. Their number system was based on 60, not 10. Count the 12 segments on the fingers of one hand with your thumb, while using the other hand's 5 fingers to track each group of 12. 12 times 5 is 60. That single counting habit is why your day has 24 hours, your hour has 60 minutes, and your circle has 360 degrees. Every time you check a clock, you're using their math. They solved quadratic equations. They calculated the volume of a cube. They understood the relationship between the sides of a right triangle over 1,000 years before a Greek named Pythagoras was even born. They invented the plow, freeing labor from farming into craft and trade. They invented the wheel, first as rollers, then as mounted wheels on axles, then as chariots, pulled by donkeys long before horses entered the picture. They built with arches and columns. They put sails on boats and turned rivers into highways. They wrote the earliest known legal codes, centuries before the far more famous Code of Hammurabi. And then there's the beer. They developed the first known brewing process, thick, sweet, unfiltered, drunk through long reed straws from shared jars. It wasn't a luxury. It was a dietary staple, and likely safer than the water, since brewing meant boiling. They even had a goddess for it, Ninkasi, the lady who fills the mouth, and a surviving hymn to her that is essentially the oldest known beer recipe in existence. They invented soap. They built the first schools where children of the elite studied reading, writing, mathematics, astronomy, and law. I want to be direct about something here. None of this reads like the stereotype of ancient people. Quadratic equations, tax law, soap, a patron goddess of beer. This isn't primitive. This is a fully functioning, deeply modern civilization. It just happened 5,000 years ago, in the mud. When people here got sick, 2 very different specialists showed up. The first was a physician, checking the pulse, the skin, the urine, prescribing herbal salves and tinctures dissolved in beer and honey. The oldest surviving medical tablet in the world, dated to around 2200 BC, lists 15 specific prescriptions. No incantation, no magic. Pure pharmacology, nearly 2,000 years before Hippocrates. The second visitor was an exorcist, because for them, illness had 2 causes at once, a physical one and a supernatural one, a demon or an angry god. Both specialists worked side by side, treating the same patient, and neither one was considered less legitimate than the other. Their catalog of medicinal plants listed roughly 340 species, organized head to toe. The same structure a modern anatomy textbook still uses today. But their view of death is where things get strange. A king here didn't simply die. He crossed over. And it turns out, sometimes his entire court crossed over with him. In the 1920s, a British archaeologist excavating the royal cemetery of Ur uncovered 16 burial chambers unlike anything else nearby. Gold helmets, necklaces of lapis lazuli, jeweled daggers, and surrounding the royal dead, rows of soldiers, musicians, and attendants, dozens of them, arranged neatly, dressed for a ceremony, showing no signs of struggle. In the largest chamber, 74 bodies were found together. Recent CT scans on some of the skulls revealed pre-mortem fractures from a blunt object. It appears that when the poison wasn't enough to finish the job quietly, someone made sure it finished anyway. Among the dead lay a woman named Puabi, a queen, identified by her seal, buried beneath a crown made of layered gold flowers. Her entire court lay silent around her, dressed for an eternity. None of them chose. For centuries, the cities here fought each other constantly. Every city had its own walls, its own god, its own dynasty. No one held power for long. Then came a man named Sargon. His origin story reads like myth, and it might partly be one. A child placed in a reed basket, set adrift on the river, raised by a stranger who found him on the bank. As a young man, he rose to become a cupbearer at a royal court. What happened next isn't recorded. But when the tablets resume, Sargon is king. He didn't just conquer cities, he conquered the entire concept of what an empire could be. He replaced the old heavy infantry formations with faster, more flexible troops. He defeated the reigning king of the south and paraded him through the gate of the holiest temple in the region in chains. Then he marched north and east until his territory stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, the first multi-ethnic empire in recorded history. But conquest and unity are two different things. His empire spoke two languages, two peoples, two entirely different ways of seeing the world. A sword can force submission. It cannot make people feel like one nation. For that, Sargon didn't use his army. He used his daughter. Her name was Enheduanna. Sargon appointed her high priestess of the most important temple in the south, the most powerful religious office in the region. She composed hymns in both languages of her father's empire, quietly stitching two cultures together through shared ritual. But her most remarkable work wasn't political. She wrote in the first person. Her own fear, her own fury, her own exile, when a rebellion drove her from her temple. I approached the light, but the light scorched me. I approached the shade, but the clouds of a storm covered me. As far as we know, no one had ever done that before. Not a hymn recited by committee. A single human consciousness, deliberately pressed into permanent clay and signed with a name. Every memoir, every diary, every piece of writing that begins with the word I traces its lineage back to her. Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, pushed further than any ruler before him, declaring himself a living god, the first Mesopotamian king to claim outright divinity. Under him, the empire reached its peak. What strikes me about this is how familiar the pattern feels. A system that runs brilliantly under a strong, capable ruler almost always turns brittle the moment a weak one inherits it. That's not a Bronze Age problem. That's every empire on this channel, without exception. Drought weakened the land. Tribal raiders began pressing in from the mountains. Within a generation of Naram-Sin's death, the empire that had conquered the known world simply ceased to exist. The invaders who took over didn't understand the irrigation system that had built this civilization in the first place. they let it rot. Cities emptied out. Only in the remote, swampy south did anything resembling the old life survive. Eventually, the invaders were driven out, and a new dynasty rebuilt from the city of Ur, restoring the canals, raising a great ziggurat, compiling one of the earliest law codes in history. For a while, it worked, but the revival was already poisoned, quite literally. Centuries of irrigation had driven salt up into the soil, and crop yields were falling. Nomadic tribes were pushing in from the west, disrupting trade. An old enemy was growing bolder in the east. In 2004 BC, that enemy sacked the city of Ur completely. The event was so traumatic that a poem was written about it, describing the gods themselves abandoning the city, temples looted, mothers fleeing with children, the dead left lying in the streets. With that, the people who had invented the city, the law, the school, and the written word ceased to exist as an independent nation. The empires that came after, Babylon most famously, simply inherited everything: their gods, their writing, their mathematics, their literature. Their language lingered for a while longer as a scholarly tongue, the way Latin would linger in medieval Europe, centuries after Rome fell. And then even that fell silent. Here's the detail that makes this story different from every other fallen empire. The Egyptians built in stone. Pyramids don't disappear. The Greeks built in marble. Their temples still stand. But this civilization built almost everything out of mud brick. And mud brick, given enough centuries, doesn't crumble into ruins you can recognize. It dissolves back into the landscape itself until an entire buried city looks exactly like the empty desert around it. For nearly 4,000 years, nobody knew they had ever existed. Not as a myth, not as a legend, not even as a rumor. It wasn't until the 1800s, when European archaeologists digging in the deserts of Iraq began pulling clay tablets out of the ground, that anyone realized what they were reading. A language older than Hebrew, older than Sanskrit, older than Greek. A people, completely erased from human memory, reassembled piece by piece from the fragments of their own tax records. What I find most remarkable about this story is the irony sitting right at its center. They invented writing specifically so that nothing important would ever be forgotten again. And they were forgotten anyway, more completely than almost any major civilization in human history. Every time you check a clock, divide a circle, sign your name, or pour a drink with friends, you're using an inheritance from people whose names you'll never know. They didn't conquer the future with armies. Armies fall. Empires fall. Even the strongest walls eventually go quiet. They conquered the future with ideas. And it turns out, unlike empires, ideas don't actually die. They just wait to be dug back up. If a civilization that invented literally everything could still vanish without a trace, it raises an obvious question. What does it actually take for an empire to survive? The video on screen right now covers a civilization that faced total destruction again and again for over 2,000 years and somehow never disappeared at all. Watch it now.